My daughter Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the brochure on my kitchen table. "Mom, we found the perfect place," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Sunset Manor has everything: activities, medical staff, people your age." My son, Michael, nodded from across the room, arms crossed like he was bracing for impact. "It's really nice, Mom. Clean, safe. You'd have your own room." I stared at the glossy photos of smiling elderly residents playing bingo and tending gardens. What they didn't know was that I'd been the anonymous buyer who purchased Sunset Manor 12 months ago. What they couldn't see was the quiet satisfaction spreading through my chest as I realized their plan had just walked straight into mine. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains I'd hung in this kitchen 43 years ago. Back when Michael was still in diapers and Sarah was just a dream we hadn't dared hope for yet. The same curtains that had filtered light over countless family dinners, homework sessions, and late-night conversations about everything from scraped knees to broken hearts. Now that light seemed different, harsher somehow, illuminating the distance that had grown between us like weeds in an untended garden. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the same chair where she used to sit and tell me about her day at school, her eyes bright with excitement over spelling tests and playground adventures. Now those same eyes avoided mine, focused instead on the brochure she'd clearly rehearsed presenting. "The thing is, Mom," she continued, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they think they're talking to someone who doesn't quite understand, "we're worried about you living alone. What if something happens? What if you fall?" I'd heard this concern before, whispered in phone calls they thought I couldn't overhear when they visited. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room, replaced by bright smiles and talk about the weather. They'd been building their case for months, collecting evidence of my supposed decline like prosecutors preparing for trial. The time I forgot to return Michael's call for 2 days because I was helping my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, after her hip surgery. The afternoon Sarah found me napping on the couch, exhausted from a charity drive I'd organized for homeless veterans. Each incident carefully cataloged, twisted into proof that I was becoming a burden they could no longer bear. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, running my fingers along the edge of the brochure. The paper was expensive, high-quality stock that spoke of marketing budgets and profit margins. "But I'm managing just fine here." The words felt hollow, even as I spoke them, not because they weren't true, but because I could see in their faces that the decision had already been made. This wasn't a discussion, it was a notification. Michael stepped forward, his expression the same serious mask he'd worn as a child when he'd been caught doing something he knew was wrong. At 42, he was successful in his own right, running a consulting firm that specialized in corporate restructuring. He understood the language of difficult decisions and uncomfortable transitions. "Mom, we've talked to the doctors. Dr. Henderson thinks it might be time to consider—" "Dr. Henderson?" I interrupted, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. "When did you talk to Dr. Henderson?" I'd been seeing the same physician for over a decade, trusted him with my health, my concerns, my private medical information. The thought that he'd been discussing my condition with my children without my knowledge felt like a betrayal wrapped in professional courtesy. Sarah and Michael exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that siblings develop over years of shared secrets and coordinated mischief. But this wasn't childhood mischief. This was my life they were discussing, my future they were planning without my input. "We're listed as your emergency contacts," Sarah said, as if that explained everything. "Dr. Henderson just wanted us to be aware of your situation." My situation. As if being 68 years old was a medical condition requiring intervention. As if the woman who'd served 2 tours in Iraq, who'd raised 2 children largely on her own while their father worked double shifts at the plant, who'd managed household finances and family crises with military precision for 4.5 decades had somehow become incapable of managing her own affairs. I stood up slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to see the deliberate nature of my movement. Wanted them to register that I wasn't frail, wasn't confused, wasn't the diminished version of myself they seemed determined to see. I think I need some time to process this, I said, keeping my voice level despite the fury building in my chest, like steam in a pressure cooker. Of course, Michael said quickly, relief evident in his voice. Take all the time you need. We just wanted you to know we're here for you. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. They were here for me, all right. Here to package me up and deliver me to a place where I'd be someone else's responsibility, someone else's problem to solve. After they left, I sat alone in my kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, the creak of floorboards that had supported generations of footsteps, the whisper of wind through windows that had weathered countless storms, the soft tick of the mantel clock that had marked time through deployments and homecomings, celebrations and sorrows, the ordinary moments that comprise a life fully lived. I thought about the phone calls that had become less frequent over the years, always brief, always focused on their needs rather than genuine connection. Sarah calling to ask if I could babysit the grandchildren, but never staying long enough to actually talk. Michael checking in with perfunctory questions about my health, his attention clearly divided between our conversation and whatever urgent email demanded his immediate response. When had I become a task on their to-do list rather than their mother? The realization had been building for months, a slow accumulation of small slights and casual dismissals that I'd tried to rationalize away. The Christmas dinner where they'd talked around me rather than to me, discussing plans and decisions as if I were a piece of furniture that happened to overhear. The birthday celebration where they'd chosen a restaurant based on their preferences, not mine, then seemed surprised when I didn't finish my meal. The gradual shift from asking for my advice to simply informing me of their choices, as if my decades of experience had expired along with some invisible warranty. But it was the discovery of their group text that had truly opened my eyes. Sarah's phone, left on my counter while she used the bathroom, had lit up with a message from Michael. How did the nursing home visit go? Think she'll go for it? The casual way they discussed my future, the assumption that I would simply comply with their decision, the complete absence of respect for my autonomy or dignity, had crystallized everything I'd been trying not to see. They saw me as a problem to be solved, not a person to be honored. They viewed my independence as stubbornness, my self-sufficiency as denial. In their minds, I'd already been reduced to the sum of my potential limitations rather than the fullness of my continued capabilities. They'd written the story of my decline before it had even begun, casting themselves as the responsible children making difficult but necessary decisions for their aging parent. What they didn't know was that I'd been writing my own story for the past year, quietly and methodically preparing for exactly this moment. While they'd been discussing my future in hushed tones and worried glances, I'd been securing it with the same strategic thinking that had served me well in the military and in raising 2 children who'd grown up to become successful adults. I'd just never imagined I'd need to protect myself from the very people I'd spent my life protecting. The purchase of Sunset Manor hadn't been impulsive or emotional. It had been calculated, researched, planned with the precision of a military operation. I'd visited the facility multiple times, reviewed their financial records, studied their staff protocols and resident satisfaction surveys. I'd met with lawyers and accountants, structured the purchase through a trust that would ensure the facility's continued operation while protecting my interests. I'd even spent time talking with current residents, understanding their experiences, their needs, their concerns about the quality of care they received. It had taken 11 months to complete the transaction, 11 months of careful planning while my children worried about my ability to manage my own affairs. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't been so painful. While they saw cognitive decline, I was executing one of the most complex business transactions of my life. While they questioned my judgment, I was making decisions that would benefit not just myself, but dozens of elderly residents who deserved better than the neglect and indifference they'd been receiving under the previous ownership. The evening. Light was fading when I finally moved from the kitchen table. The brochure still spread before me like evidence in a case I was only beginning to understand. I walked through the house I'd called home for over 4 decades, seeing it through new eyes. Not as the place where I was becoming a burden, but as the sanctuary I'd built through years of sacrifice and love. Every room held memories of the family I'd nurtured, the children I'd raised, the life I'd constructed with my own hands and heart. But I also saw it as they must see it now. Outdated furniture that showed its age, family photos that reminded them of obligations rather than joy, spaces that spoke of the past rather than the future they were eager to build without me in it. I'd become the keeper of memories they no longer wanted to carry, the living reminder of responsibilities they found inconvenient. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the 22 years I'd served in the Army, the discipline and strategic thinking that had become second nature. I'd learned to assess situations quickly, identify objectives, and develop plans that achieved desired outcomes while minimizing risk. I'd learned to adapt when circumstances changed, to remain calm under pressure, to lead when leadership was required, and follow when following served the greater good. But most importantly, I'd learned to recognize when I was being underestimated by people who mistook quiet observation for passive acceptance. I'd learned to use that underestimation as an advantage, allowing others to reveal their true intentions while I prepared responses they never saw coming. It was a skill that had served me well in military command, in raising stubborn teenagers, and now, apparently, in dealing with adult children who'd forgotten that the woman they were trying to manage had once managed far more challenging situations than a simple real estate transaction. Tomorrow, I would call the facility administrator at Sunset Manor, the man who reported to me without knowing it, and discuss the improvements I wanted to implement. Better staff training, enhanced medical protocols, upgraded facilities that would truly serve the residents rather than simply warehouse them. I would review the applications that had been piling up, elderly people seeking admission to a place they hoped would treat them with dignity and respect. And then I would wait, with the patience that 4 decades of motherhood had taught me, for my children to make their next move. Because I'd learned something else in my years of service and sacrifice. The most powerful response to being underestimated isn't anger or confrontation. It's the quiet satisfaction of proving exactly how wrong they were about you, and how much they still had to learn about the woman who'd raised them to be better than this. The brochure lay on my kitchen table like a declaration of war disguised as an act of love. But wars, I'd learned, weren't always won by the side that fired the first shot. Sometimes they were won by the side that had been planning the longest, preparing the most carefully, and understood the terrain better than anyone realized. And I'd been surveying this particular battlefield for longer than they knew. The manila folder sat in my desk drawer like a sleeping accusation, thick with receipts and phone records that told a story my children thought I'd never piece together. I'd started collecting the evidence 6 months ago, not out of suspicion, but out of the methodical habit that had kept me organized through 2 decades of military service and 4 decades of motherhood. Every family has its rhythms, its patterns, of give and take, but somewhere along the way, our family's rhythm had become a one-way drumbeat. Sarah's call at 7 a.m. had been typical. "Mom, I hate to ask, but Jason's car broke down and we need to get him to soccer practice. Could you pick him up? And maybe grab some groceries for dinner tonight? I'll pay you back." The payment never came, of course. It never did. But I'd dutifully driven across town, collected my 15-year-old grandson, listened to him complain about his parents while simultaneously texting his friends, then spent $63 on groceries for a dinner I wouldn't be invited to share. The receipt was paper-clipped to 11 others from similar requests over the past 2 months. Emergency babysitting that turned into regular childcare. last-minute grocery runs that became expected service, school pickups that happened. Because Sarah's yoga class was more important than her son's transportation needs. Each receipt represented not just money spent, but time given freely, love offered without expectation of return. But it was the phone records that revealed the most damning pattern. I'd requested them from my cellular provider as part of what I'd told myself was routine financial planning. The truth was harder to swallow. In the past year, Sarah had called me 47 times. Of those calls, 42 had been requests for help, favors, or money. 3 had been obligatory holiday check-ins. 2 had been complaints about Michael or her husband Dave. 0 had been simply to see how I was doing. Michael's numbers were even more stark. 31 calls in 12 months, 28 requests for various forms of assistance. 2 calls to inform me of family events I was expected to attend. 1 call to tell me he'd been promoted at work, though even that had ended with him asking if I could help watch the kids the following weekend because he and Linda wanted to celebrate. I spread the records across my kitchen table like evidence in a court case, which, in a way, they were. Each entry represented a moment when my children had reduced me to a resource rather than a relationship. Emergency babysitter, reliable transportation, convenient bank account. Always available, always willing, never questioning the fairness of an arrangement that seemed to benefit everyone except the person providing the benefits. The most painful entry was highlighted in yellow. Sarah's call on my birthday 3 months ago. Duration: 4 minutes, 37 seconds. I remembered the conversation perfectly. Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry we can't make it for dinner. Jason has a game. Oh, by the way, could you loan us $200? Dave's commission check was late and we need to cover the mortgage payment. Thanks, you're the best. I'd given her the money, of course. Transferred it electronically within minutes of hanging up the phone. The payment had never been returned, never been mentioned again. My birthday dinner had been a frozen meal eaten alone while watching television. The silence broken only by the neighbor's dog barking at shadows in their yard. Pattern extended beyond phone calls and financial requests. I pulled out my calendar, the one I'd faithfully maintained since my Army days, and began marking entries with different colored pens. Blue for requests that came with less than 24 hours' notice. Red for requests that interrupted my own plans. Green for requests that were presented as emergencies but turned out to be conveniences. The pages looked like a rainbow of imposed obligations. March 15th. Sarah needed me to watch the kids because her regular babysitter was sick. I'd canceled my doctor's appointment to accommodate her schedule. April 3rd. Michael needed help moving furniture to his new office. I'd skipped my book club meeting, something I looked forward to each month. May 22nd. Emergency grocery shopping for Sarah's dinner party because she'd forgotten until 3 hours before guests arrived. I'd abandoned my weekly coffee with Mrs. Patterson, the only social interaction I'd planned that week. Each colored mark represented a choice I'd made to prioritize their needs over my own well-being. At the time, these choices had felt natural, maternal, the automatic response of a mother who put her children's happiness before her own comfort. But seeing them mapped out visually, the sheer volume and frequency of requests made it impossible to ignore the imbalance. I found myself thinking about my Army unit, the bonds we'd forged through mutual respect and shared sacrifice. Military families understood that service meant everyone contributed according to their abilities, and everyone supported each other when needed. There was reciprocity, acknowledgement, gratitude that went beyond words to genuine appreciation. When Sergeant Martinez helped me move into base housing, I helped her family during her deployment. When Captain Williams covered my shifts during my father's funeral, I returned the favor when his daughter was born. But my relationship with my own children had devolved into something unrecognizable from those military bonds. I was the permanent giver, they were the permanent receivers, and somewhere along the way, they'd stopped seeing the inequality of that arrangement. My generosity had become their expectation, my reliability their entitlement, my love their insurance, policy against the consequences of their own poor planning. The financial records were even more sobering. I'd kept meticulous records of every loan, every emergency payment, every temporary assistance I'd provided over the past 5 years. The total was staggering: $37,412, not including the countless hours of babysitting, the grocery runs, the transportation services, the household repairs I'd funded without being asked to contribute. None of it had been repaid. None of it had even been acknowledged as debt. At some point, my children had stopped saying, "I'll pay you back," and started saying, "Thanks, Mom," as if my financial support was as natural and expected as rainfall. They'd redefined our relationship, from mutual family support to automatic resource extraction, and I'd been too busy providing to notice when the change occurred. I pulled out my laptop and opened the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining, though I'd never intended it to become evidence of familial exploitation. Each entry was dated, categorized, cross-referenced with the circumstances that prompted the request. Emergency car repairs that could have been prevented with regular maintenance, mortgage payments for a house they'd purchased beyond their means, private school tuition they'd committed to without ensuring they could afford it, vacation funds for trips they'd booked before calculating the cost. What struck me wasn't just the amounts, but the pattern of escalation. What had started as occasional $20 favors had grown into routine $100 expectations, then $500 emergencies, then $1,000 crises that somehow never qualified as actual crises requiring them to make difficult choices or lifestyle adjustments. Instead, they'd simply added me to their financial planning as a reliable backup source, the family bank that never closed and never charged interest. The most infuriating entry was from 2 months ago: Michael's request for $3,000 to cover his daughter's dental work. I'd provided the money immediately, worried about my granddaughter's health and well-being. 3 weeks later, I'd seen Linda's Facebook post about their weekend getaway to Napa Valley, complete with photos of expensive wine tastings and luxury accommodations. The timing wasn't coincidental. They'd used my concern for their daughter to fund their recreational activities, then posted the evidence of their deception for all their friends to see. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd maintained for 40 years. The roses I'd planted when Sarah was born were still blooming, though they required more care now, more attention to their changing needs. The vegetable garden that had fed my family through lean years was smaller now, adapted to my current circumstances, but still productive, still contributing to my independence and self-sufficiency. My children saw the garden as evidence of my inability to let go, my stubborn refusal to acknowledge my limitations. They complained about the time I spent weeding and watering, the physical effort required to maintain something I could easily replace with store-bought produce. They didn't understand that the garden represented continuity, competence, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful with my own hands. But looking at it now, through the lens of the evidence I'd accumulated, I saw something different. I saw the metaphor for our entire relationship. I'd been tending this family garden for decades, providing the nutrients and care that allowed others to flourish, while they viewed my efforts as either unnecessary or insufficient. They consumed what I produced without contributing to its maintenance, then wondered why I seemed tired, why I seemed to need more help with tasks I'd once managed effortlessly. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Sarah's voice was strained, artificially casual in the way that meant she was about to ask for something significant. "Mom, I know this is short notice, but Jason's school called. He got into some trouble and they're suspending him for 3 days. Dave and I both have important meetings this week and we can't take time off. Could you, maybe, let me call you back?" I said, cutting her off mid-request. For the first time in years, I hung up without automatically agreeing to solve her problem. The silence that followed felt strange. almost foreign. How long had it been since I'd said no to my children? How long since I'd considered my own schedule, my own needs, before agreeing to rearrange my life around their convenience? Walked back to the desk and opened the folder again, this time focusing on the timeline rather than the amounts. The requests had intensified over the past year, coinciding perfectly with their increased discussions about my declining capabilities and their concerns about my living alone. The correlation wasn't subtle once I recognized it. As they'd increased their demands on my time, money, and energy, they'd simultaneously built their case for my inadequacy. They'd created the very problems they now claim to be solving. By treating me as their personal support system, they'd isolated me from other relationships, other activities, other sources of fulfillment and purpose. Then they'd pointed to that isolation as evidence that I needed professional care and structured social interaction. They'd depleted my energy with constant requests and emergencies, then expressed concern about my apparent fatigue and reduced activity levels. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, though I didn't think they'd planned it consciously. More likely, they'd simply followed the path of least resistance, taking advantage of my willingness to help until that help became an expectation, then an entitlement, then a diagnostic tool for measuring my competence. They'd used my love against me, weaponized my maternal instincts to serve their convenience, then reframed my resulting exhaustion as proof of my decline. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, indisputable. But evidence was only useful if someone was willing to hear it. And I'd learned enough about my children's current mindset to know they weren't ready for that conversation. They'd rationalize, minimize, redirect the blame back to my apparent inability to understand their good intentions. They'd remind me of all the things they'd done for me, though I suspected that list would be significantly shorter and less expensive than the records I'd compiled. Instead, I closed the folder and locked it in my desk drawer, next to the deed, for Sunset Manor and the business plans I'd been developing for the facility's renovation. The evidence would be there when I needed it, but for now, it served a different purpose. It had shown me exactly where I stood in my children's hierarchy of priorities, and it had confirmed what I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. They saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. That knowledge hurt, but it also liberated me. I no longer had to wonder whether I was being overly sensitive or unreasonably demanding. I no longer had to question whether their concerns about my welfare were genuine or convenient. The numbers didn't lie. The patterns didn't deceive, and the evidence didn't require interpretation. My children had spent the past several years extracting value from our relationship while simultaneously building a case for my incompetence. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that because I gave freely, I gave blindly. They'd mistaken my generosity for naivety, my love for weakness, my quiet observation for passive acceptance. They had no idea that the woman they were trying to manage had been documenting their management techniques with the same precision she'd once used to track enemy movements and resource allocations in places where miscalculations cost lives. Tomorrow, I would begin implementing the lessons those records had taught me. Not out of revenge or anger, but out of the hard-earned wisdom that comes from finally seeing clearly what had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains as I lay still, listening to the sounds that had become the soundtrack of my supposed decline. Sarah's voice carried through the thin walls of the duplex next door, sharp with frustration as she barked orders at Jason about his breakfast and backpack. Michael's car door slammed, in my driveway, followed by the heavy footsteps of someone who believed he was arriving to handle a crisis rather than create one. They had no idea I'd been awake for an hour, watching them through the gap in my curtains, observing the choreography of their concern. I remained in bed, not from weakness or confusion, but from strategy. Let them think I was sleeping late, another sign of my deteriorating condition to add to their growing list. Let them whisper in my kitchen about medication schedules and fall risks while I cataloged every word, every assumption, every casual dismissal of my competence. The woman they thought was losing her grip was actually tightening it, preparing for moves they couldn't see coming. Their voices drifted up the stairs, a mixture of Sarah's theatrical worry and Michael's businessman efficiency. She didn't answer. Her phone last night, Sarah was saying, her tone suggesting this was evidence of cognitive decline rather than a deliberate choice. And look at this mail pile. She's not keeping up with things like she used to. The mail pile was deliberate, of course. 3 days' worth of advertisements, newsletters, and routine correspondence I'd left stacked on the kitchen counter like breadcrumbs leading to their predetermined conclusion. They needed evidence of my declining organizational skills, so I'd provided it. Nothing important, nothing that couldn't wait, but enough paper to support their narrative of a woman overwhelmed by simple tasks. "Mom?" Michael's voice called up the stairs, carefully modulated, to sound concerned rather than impatient. "Are you awake? We brought coffee from that place you like." The coffee shop they thought I liked was actually their preference, not mine. But I'd never corrected their assumption. It was easier to let them believe they knew my tastes than to engage in the small corrections that might reveal how little attention they actually paid to my preferences. I slipped on my robe, deliberately slowly, and made my way downstairs with the careful steps of someone who wanted to appear frail without actually risking injury. "Good morning," I said, accepting the coffee cup Sarah thrust toward me with the enthusiasm of someone presenting evidence to a jury. "This is unexpected." "We were worried," Sarah said, settling onto my couch without invitation. "You seemed upset yesterday when we showed you the brochure. We wanted to make sure you're okay." I sipped the too-strong coffee and studied their faces over the rim of the cup. Sarah's expression was a masterpiece of performed concern, eyes wide, with what she probably thought was compassion but read more like impatience barely contained. Michael stood near the window, checking his phone with the discreet glances of someone who had more important places to be but was fulfilling an obligation. "I'm fine," I said, settling into my chair with the measured movements they expected from someone my age. "Just processing everything you told me yesterday." "That's completely normal," Sarah said quickly, leaning forward with the body language of someone prepared to overcome objections. "It's a big change, and change is hard at any age. But Mom, you have to understand, we're not getting any younger either. We have our own families to think about, our own responsibilities." The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Their own responsibilities. As if I had somehow become separate from that category. As if 45 years of being their first resource and last resort had earned me the distinction of becoming someone else's problem to solve. "I understand," I said, because it was true. I understood perfectly. They needed me to be incompetent so they could stop feeling guilty about their neglect. They needed me to be declining so they could justify their decreasing investment in our relationship. They needed me to need professional care so they could redirect their attention to people and activities that brought them more satisfaction. Michael cleared his throat, the sound he'd made since childhood when he was about to say something he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "The thing is, Mom, we've already put down a deposit at Sunset Manor. We wanted to secure your spot because there's usually a waiting list for the better facilities." The information landed like a chess piece moved without my knowledge, a game. I was apparently playing whether I'd agreed to participate or not. They'd committed my future without my consent, spent money I hadn't authorized on a decision I hadn't made. The audacity was breathtaking, but I kept my expression neutral, giving them nothing to work with except the silence they'd interpret as either acceptance or confusion. "A deposit," I repeated, as if testing the word's meaning. "How much?" $5,000, Sarah said quickly, as if the speed of her response would minimize the significance of the amount. "But it's refundable if you change your mind within 30 days. We just wanted to make sure you had options." Options. The word was almost insulting in its inaccuracy. Options implied choice, alternatives, the freedom to select from multiple possibilities. What they'd given me was an ultimatum disguised as generosity, a decision presented as if I'd been consulted when clearly the consultation was purely ceremonial. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at Mrs. Patterson's house, where she was tending her flower garden despite the arthritis that made every movement deliberate and sometimes painful. At 74, she lived alone, drove herself to appointments, maintained her property, and contributed to our neighborhood's social fabric through the simple act of refusing to surrender her independence before circumstances actually required it. Mrs. Patterson seems to manage well on her own, I said, not turning around. She's 6 years older than I am. Mrs. Patterson doesn't have children who care about her safety, Michael said, his voice carrying the slight edge that appeared when he thought I was being deliberately difficult. And frankly, Mom, she probably should be in a facility too. It's not safe for people our age to live alone without proper supervision. Our age. At 68, I was apparently grouped with his theoretical version of elderhood rather than recognized as an individual with specific capabilities and limitations. I'd become a demographic rather than a person, subject to generalized assumptions about what people my age could or couldn't handle, rather than honest assessment of what I actually struggled with or managed successfully. What exactly makes you think I need supervision? I asked, turning to face them directly. The question was simple, but I could see it made them uncomfortable. They'd been operating on vague concerns and general worries rather than specific evidence of actual problems. Sarah and Michael exchanged one of their looks, the wordless communication that excluded me from conversations about my own life. It's not any one thing, Sarah said carefully. It's just, you're forgetting things more often, like last month when you missed your dentist appointment. I'd missed the appointment because I'd been at the hospital with Mrs. Patterson during her emergency surgery, but I didn't correct them. Let them build their case on incomplete information. Let them reveal how little they actually knew about my daily activities and commitments. And your driving, Michael added, gaining confidence from Sarah's example. Linda saw you at the grocery store last week, and you seemed confused about where you'd parked your car. I'd been helping an elderly gentleman find his own vehicle in the parking lot, walking with him through 3 rows of cars until we located his blue sedan. But again, I said nothing. Their version of events was more useful to their argument, so they'd constructed it without bothering to verify the details. Plus, the house is getting to be too much for you, Sarah continued, warming to her theme. The yard work, the maintenance, the cleaning. It's not fair to expect you to keep up with all of that at your age. The house I'd maintained meticulously for 4 decades, the property that had increased in value precisely because of my consistent care and attention to detail, was now being presented as evidence of my inadequacy rather than testament to my competence. They saw burden where others would see accomplishment, problems where objective observers would see solutions. I returned to my chair and set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. Have you visited Sunset Manor yourselves? Spent time there, talked to the residents, observed the quality of care? Another exchange of glances. We did the virtual tour online, Sarah said, and we read all the reviews. The ratings are excellent. Online. Research, I repeated, but no actual visits. We trusted the professional assessment, Michael said defensively. Dr. Henderson recommended it specifically for patients with your profile. My profile. Another reduction of my individuality to a set of standardized characteristics that could be matched with appropriate institutional responses. I wondered what my profile said, how my children had described me to medical professionals who'd never met me but were willing to make recommendations about my living situation based on secondhand reports from people who saw me primarily as a problem to be solved. I'd like to visit the facility myself before making any decisions, I said, watching their faces carefully. See what I'd be committing to. Relief flooded Sarah's expression. Of course, that's a great idea. We can drive you there this afternoon. If you want. Give you the full tour, let you see how nice it really is. I'd prefer to go alone, I said quietly. This is my decision to make, and I need to evaluate it without influence from people who've already made up their minds. The relief vanished, replaced by the kind of concern parents show when a child insists on making a decision they're not mature enough to handle properly. "Mom, I don't think that's wise," Michael said. "What if you get confused about the directions? What if you have questions we could help answer?" "I've been driving longer than you've been alive," I pointed out, "and I managed to navigate considerably more challenging terrain during my military service. I think I can handle a trip across town." But even as I said it, I could see them adding this conversation to their evidence file. Her insistence on independence, her resistance to reasonable help, her stubborn refusal to acknowledge her limitations. They'd reframe my competence as defiance, my autonomy as denial, my rational request for uninfluenced evaluation as proof of the cognitive decline they needed to justify their predetermined course of action. They stayed for another hour, filling the time with small talk that felt like surveillance. Sarah commented on the dust on my coffee table, as if a week's worth of normal accumulation was evidence of declining housekeeping standards. Michael noticed that I'd missed a section while vacuuming, pointing it out with the casual observation of someone building a case rather than offering to help. Every small imperfection was catalogued, every minor oversight transformed into supporting evidence for their larger argument. When they finally left, promising to call later to confirm my visit to Sunset Manor, I watched from my window as they stood beside Michael's car in my driveway, their conversation animated with the satisfaction of people who believed their plan was proceeding smoothly. They had no idea I could read lips well enough to catch key phrases, "went better than expected," and "she's coming around," and by Christmas, 4 months away. They'd already established their timeline for my transition from independent resident to managed care recipient. 4 months to complete the paperwork, handle the logistics, and present my relocation as a fait accompli to extended family and friends who might ask uncomfortable questions about the necessity or timing of such a dramatic change. I closed the curtains and walked to my desk, where the folder of evidence waited alongside the documents they'd never thought to look for. The purchase agreement for Sunset Manor, the business plan for facility improvements, the legal documentation establishing my authority over every aspect of the operation they wanted to surrender me to. Tomorrow, I would visit my own property, walk through the facilities I'd already begun upgrading, meet with the staff who reported to me without knowing my identity. I would evaluate Sunset Manor not as a potential resident being processed for admission, but as the owner assessing whether the facility met my standards for the people who would live there. And I would begin to understand exactly what my children thought was good enough for their mother, compared to what I'd already decided was good enough for myself. The drive to Sunset Manor took exactly 18 minutes, a route I'd memorized during the months of due diligence that preceded my purchase of the facility. Every pothole, every traffic light, every landmark was familiar territory, though today I approached it from the perspective my children expected. A nervous elderly woman evaluating her potential new home rather than the property owner conducting a surprise inspection of her investment. I parked in the visitors section, noting immediately that the landscaping improvements I'd requested were already underway. The tired shrubs that had lined the entrance during my initial visits had been replaced with vibrant perennials that would provide color through multiple seasons. The cracked sidewalk had been repaired and widened to accommodate wheelchairs and walkers more safely. Even the entrance sign looked different, freshly painted with lettering that was easier to read from a distance. My facility manager, David Rodriguez, met me at the front desk with the professional warmth I'd come to expect from him during our monthly meetings. He had no idea I was anything other than a prospective resident whose family had made preliminary arrangements, and his performance in that role would tell me everything I needed to know about how other families were treated during this vulnerable transition process. "Mrs. Harper," he said, using the surname I'd provided when scheduling the appointment. "Welcome to Sunset Manor. I'm David, and I'll be giving you the tour today. I understand your family has already submitted some preliminary paperwork?" The question hung in the air with exactly the right balance of professionalism and genuine interest. David had been worth every penny of the salary increase I'd approved when I hired him 6 months ago. His background in healthcare administration was impressive, but more importantly, he treated potential residents as people making important decisions rather than problems being processed through a system. Yes, though I wanted to see everything for myself before making any final commitments, I said, adopting the slightly hesitant tone of someone overwhelmed by a decision they weren't entirely ready to make. This is all very new to me. Of course, David said, his expression shifting to the gentle patience I'd observed him use with other families during my unannounced visits. This is one of the biggest decisions you'll ever make, and you should have all the information you need to feel confident about it. Why don't we start with the common areas, and you can ask questions about anything that concerns you? We walked through the renovated lobby, where I'd replaced the institutional fluorescent lighting with warm LED fixtures that created a more residential atmosphere. The furniture was new too, sturdy enough for elderly residents but comfortable enough that visitors would want to stay and spend time rather than hurry through obligatory visits. The changes had cost $43,000, but seeing them through David's presentation made the investment feel worthwhile. One thing that sets us apart from other facilities, David explained as we moved toward the dining room, is our focus on maintaining residents' independence and dignity. We're not here to manage people's lives for them. We're here to provide support that allows them to continue living their lives as fully as possible. The dining room was buzzing with lunch preparation, and I could smell the difference my new dietary program had made. Instead of the bland institutional food that characterized too many facilities, residents were being served meals that actually looked and smelled appetizing. I'd hired a new head chef, whose background included restaurant management, and the investment was evident in every detail, from seasoning to presentation. We serve 3 meals a day, but residents aren't required to eat in the dining room if they prefer privacy, David continued. Each apartment has a kitchenette, so people can prepare their own snacks or light meals if they want to. We found that maintaining some control over food choices helps people feel more at home. An elderly woman at a nearby table caught my attention, not because she looked familiar, but because she was laughing at something her dining companion had said. Real laughter, not the polite social noise that often characterized institutional interactions. The sound reminded me why I'd purchased this place. Not to warehouse elderly people until they died, but to create a community where they could continue to thrive. What about medical care? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'd personally reviewed every aspect of our healthcare protocols during the transition to new ownership. We have a registered nurse on staff 24 hours a day, and residents. Personal physicians can continue treating them here if they prefer continuity of care, David explained. We also have arrangements with several local specialists who make regular visits. The goal is to provide medical support without disrupting established doctor-patient relationships unless residents specifically want to make changes. This had been one of my most important requirements when restructuring the facility's operations. Too many nursing homes forced residents to abandon medical providers they'd trusted for years, creating unnecessary stress during an already difficult transition. I'd made sure Sunset Manor would support residents' existing healthcare relationships rather than override them for administrative convenience. We moved through the activity rooms, where I observed a book club discussion, a watercolor painting, class, and a small group playing bridge with the intense concentration that suggested real engagement rather than time-filling busy work. These programs had been expanded significantly since my acquisition, with activities designed around residents' interests rather than staff convenience. Do residents have input into the activities that are offered? I asked, watching an elderly man explain a chess strategy to his opponent with obvious enthusiasm. Absolutely, David replied. We survey residents quarterly about their interests, and we try to accommodate special requests when possible. Last month, one of our residents who used to teach high school history started leading discussion groups about World War II. It's become one of our most popular programs. The memory care unit was our next stop, and I was particularly interested in David's presentation of this section. Dementia care required specialized approaches, and I'd invested heavily in staff training and environmental modifications to ensure residents with cognitive challenges received appropriate support without being treated as problems to be contained. This area requires keypad access to ensure residents' safety, David explained. But we've designed it to feel as much like a regular neighborhood as possible. Notice that the hallways aren't institutional green. We use colors and artwork to help residents navigate more easily, and each apartment door has individual decorations that help people identify their own space. The modifications had been expensive but essential. Traditional nursing home design often confused and distressed residents with dementia, so I'd worked with specialists to create an environment that reduced anxiety while maintaining security. The result was a space that felt more like a residential community than a medical facility. What about visitors? I asked. Are there restrictions on when family can visit or how long they can stay? No time restrictions, David said immediately. Some facilities limit visiting hours, but we think that's counterproductive. Family relationships don't operate on institutional schedules, and we want to support those connections rather than regulate them. Residents can have visitors anytime, and family members are welcome to join residents for meals or activities if they want to participate. This policy had been another of my non-negotiable requirements. I'd visited too many facilities, where family access was limited by staff convenience rather than residents' needs. If I was going to live here eventually, I wanted to ensure that meaningful relationships could continue without bureaucratic interference. We completed the tour in the residential wing, where David showed me a typical apartment. The space was larger than I'd expected, with a separate bedroom, living area, and the kitchenette he'd mentioned earlier. Large windows provided natural light, and the bathroom had been modified with safety features that were functional without being obviously institutional. Each apartment comes furnished, but residents are encouraged to bring personal items that make the space feel like home, David explained. Family photos, favorite chairs, artwork, whatever helps people maintain their sense of identity and connection to their previous life. I stood at the window, looking out at the courtyard where several residents were enjoying the afternoon sunshine. Some were reading, others were chatting in small groups, and a few were tending the raised garden beds I'd had installed as part of the outdoor improvements. The scene looked peaceful, purposeful, nothing like the warehousing atmosphere I'd feared my children were preparing to subject me to. What kind of support do residents receive during the transition period? I asked. Moving here must be stressful, especially for people who've lived independently for a long time. We assign each new resident a transition coordinator who helps with everything from unpacking to learning our routines, David said. The first month can be challenging, so we make sure people have extra support until they feel comfortable. We also encourage family members to visit frequently during those first few weeks. Familiar faces make everything easier. The irony wasn't lost on me. The facility my children wanted to abandon me to actually provided more family support than they'd been offering in recent years. Sunset Manor was designed to supplement family relationships, not replace them, while my own children seemed to view it as a substitute for their continued involvement in my life. Are there residents I could speak with directly? I asked. I'd like to hear about their experiences from their perspective. Certainly, David said, leading me back toward the common areas. Most of our residents are happy to talk about their experiences here. I think you'll find they're quite honest about both the positives and the challenges. We approached an elderly woman sitting by herself near the lobby's large windows, working on what appeared to be a crossword puzzle. David introduced me as someone considering residency, and she immediately invited me to sit beside her. How long have you lived here? I asked. 8 months, she replied. My daughter thought I needed more supervision after I had a small stroke. I wasn't thrilled about leaving my house, but I have to admit, this place has grown on me. What do you like about it? The people mostly. Staff treats us like adults, not children. And there's always something to do if you want company, but nobody bothers you if you prefer to be alone. My daughter visits twice a week, which is more than she managed when I was living independently, and she was worried about me all the time. The observation struck me as particularly relevant to my own situation. Moving to Sunset Manor had actually improved this woman's relationship with her daughter by removing the stress and guilt that had complicated their interactions when she lived alone. Instead of constant worry about her mother's safety, the daughter could focus on simply enjoying their time together. "Are there things you miss about living independently?" I asked. "Of course," she said honestly. "I miss my garden, though they let me plant vegetables in the raised beds outside. I miss cooking full meals, though honestly, I wasn't doing much of that toward the end anyway. Mostly I miss the illusion that I was completely self-sufficient, but that was becoming more illusion than reality." Her honesty was refreshing, and it reminded me why I'd wanted to visit the facility without my children's influence. They would have steered the conversation toward validation of their decision, rather than honest evaluation of the trade-offs involved. This woman was giving me the kind of real information I needed to make an informed choice, whenever that choice became necessary. After speaking with 3 more residents, each offering different perspectives on their experiences, David walked me back to the entrance. "Do you have other questions I can answer?" he asked. "Just one," I said. "What happens if someone changes their mind after moving in? If they decide this isn't the right fit?" "We work with them to explore alternatives," David said without hesitation. "Sometimes people need different levels of care than we provide. Sometimes they're not ready for community living and prefer to try home modifications or in-home support first. We're here to serve residents' needs, not to keep them here against their will." The answer was perfect, exactly what I'd hoped to hear from the facility manager I'd hired to run my property. David understood that Sunset Manor was supposed to be a resource for elderly people and their families, not a prison disguised as healthcare. The business model I'd implemented was designed around resident satisfaction and family peace of mind, not maximum occupancy regardless of fit. As I drove home, I thought about the disconnect between the facility I'd just toured and the way my children had presented it. They'd described Sunset Manor as a solution to problems I didn't have, a necessity driven by limitations I hadn't experienced. But what I'd observed was a community designed to support people who were making thoughtful transitions rather than being forced into unwanted changes. The question wasn't whether Sunset Manor was a good place. It was whether my children's assessment of my need for it was accurate, and whether their timeline for that transition was driven by my well-being or their convenience. After spending the afternoon evaluating my own property through their lens, I was beginning to understand exactly how wide the gap was between their perception of my situation and the reality I was actually living. The legal documents spread across. My dining room table told a story my children would never expect to read. Purchase agreements, inspection reports, contractor estimates, staff evaluations, financial projections, 12 months of careful planning disguised as the declining competence they'd attributed to my age. While they'd been building their case for my inadequacy, I'd been executing one of the most complex business acquisitions of my life. The transformation of Sunset Manor hadn't happened by accident. Every improvement I'd observed during yesterday's tour had been planned, budgeted, and implemented under my direct supervision. The new landscaping, updated lighting, enhanced dietary program, expanded activities, specialized dementia care protocols. None of it had existed when I'd first visited the facility 13 months ago as a prospective buyer, rather than a potential resident. I pulled out the original inspection report, dated 14 months earlier, and compared it to the current operational standards. The contrast was stark enough to justify the $2.3 million purchase price and the additional $800,000 I'd invested in immediate improvements. The previous owners had been running Sunset Manor as a barely adequate warehouse for elderly people whose Families needed them housed somewhere, anywhere, as long as it was affordable and convenient. My vision had been different from the beginning. If I was eventually going to need residential care, and at 68, that possibility couldn't be entirely dismissed. I wanted that care to be provided in a facility that treated residents as people deserving respect and dignity, rather than problems requiring management. More importantly, I wanted to create that standard of care for other elderly people whose families might be making decisions based on convenience rather than quality. The business plan I'd developed with my financial advisor had been meticulously researched. The local market for quality senior living was underserved, with most facilities focusing on cost containment rather than resident satisfaction. By investing in staff training, physical improvements, and program expansion, Sunset Manor could command premium rates while providing genuinely superior care. The financial projections showed profitability within 18 months, with potential for expansion to additional locations if the model proved successful. But profitability hadn't been my primary motivation. The real return on investment would be measured in the quality of life provided to residents who deserved better than the institutional mediocrity that characterized too many senior living facilities. Every dollar spent on improvements was an investment in the dignity and well-being of people who'd been reduced to line items in their families' budgets for managing inconvenient responsibilities. I opened my laptop and reviewed the staff reports I received monthly from David Rodriguez. Employee satisfaction was up 40% since the ownership transition, largely due to the salary increases and professional development opportunities I'd implemented. Staff turnover, a chronic problem in senior care, had dropped to less than half the industry average. When employees felt valued and fairly compensated, they provided better care to residents. The correlation was obvious, though apparently not obvious enough for most facility owners. Resident satisfaction scores told an even more compelling story. The quarterly surveys I'd instituted showed consistent improvement across every category: food quality, activity programming, staff responsiveness, facility maintenance, and overall satisfaction with their living experience. 3 residents had moved out during my first year of ownership, but 2 had been transfers to higher levels of medical care, and 1 had been a personality conflict with another resident that couldn't be resolved. None had left due to dissatisfaction with the facility itself. The waiting list for admission had grown to 47 names, a dramatic increase from the 12 people who'd been hoping for openings when I purchased the property. Word of mouth in the local senior community was powerful, and families who'd initially chosen Sunset Manor as an affordable option were now recommending it as a quality choice. I'd raised rates twice since taking ownership, and demand had increased each time. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How did your visit go yesterday? Call me when you have a chance to talk about it." The message carried the barely contained eagerness of someone expecting validation for a decision they'd already made. She wanted me to report that Sunset Manor was acceptable, that I was ready to acknowledge the necessity of moving there, that her timeline for my transition could proceed without further resistance. Instead of responding immediately, I walked to my home office and opened the safe where I kept the most sensitive documents related to my Sunset Manor investment. The original purchase agreement was there, along with the legal documentation establishing the trust structure I'd used to maintain anonymity. My attorney had recommended the trust approach to protect my privacy and provide flexibility for future estate planning, but it had the additional benefit of allowing me to observe my own facility's operations without staff knowing their true employer. The trust documents were complex, but the essential structure was straightforward. I was the sole beneficiary and decision-maker, with authority to direct all aspects of the facility's operation. David Rodriguez reported to a board of trustees that consisted of my attorney, my financial advisor, and myself using a different identity. The arrangement provided oversight and accountability while maintaining the confidentiality I'd wanted during the transition period. But the most interesting document in the safe was one my children had never seen: my updated will, drafted specifically to address the situation I now found myself in. The original version had been standard family estate planning, with assets divided between Sarah and Michael according to their needs and my desire to treat them equally. The new version was considerably more nuanced, with provisions that would surprise them if they ever had occasion to read it. The estate planning attorney I'd worked with specialized in what she called values-based giving, structuring bequests, to reflect the donor's principles rather than simply transferring wealth to the next generation. My new will included detailed provisions about how my assets would be distributed, based on my children's treatment of me during my lifetime, their involvement in my care decisions, and their respect for my autonomy and dignity. If they proceeded, with their current plan to place me in Sunset Manor against my will, they would eventually inherit the facility where they'd abandoned me. The irony was intentional, though I suspected they'd miss it entirely. They would become responsible for maintaining the quality of care I'd established, continuing the investment in resident well-being I'd prioritized, and ensuring that other, elderly people received the respect and dignity they'd failed to show their own mother. The will also included provisions for the residents themselves. A significant portion of my estate would be held in trust to guarantee funding for the enhanced programs and services I'd implemented, ensuring that future ownership changes couldn't compromise the quality of care I'd worked to establish. The elderly people who lived at Sunset Manor would have legal protection against the kind of cost-cutting and corner-cutting that had characterized the facility's previous operation. But those provisions would only take effect if my children followed through with their current plan. If they reconsidered their approach, if they chose to support my continued independence rather than engineer my institutionalization, the will would revert to more traditional estate planning that recognized their changed relationship with me. The choice was theirs, though they had no idea they were making it. I closed the safe and returned to the dining room, where the afternoon light was illuminating the financial reports that documented Sunset Manor's transformation. The numbers were impressive, but they represented more than business success. They represented my refusal to accept the limitations others wanted to impose on me, my determination to maintain control over my own future, and my commitment to creating something valuable for people who deserved better than they were receiving. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the quarterly budget projections. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I could predict the conversation before answering. He would ask about my facility visit, express satisfaction that I was coming around to their way of thinking, and probably suggest accelerating the timeline for my move to take advantage of my apparent acceptance of their plan. "Hi, Michael," I said, adopting the slightly tired tone they expected from someone overwhelmed by difficult decisions. "Mom, I'm glad I caught you. Sarah said you visited Sunset Manor yesterday. How did it go?" "It was educational," I said carefully. "The facility is much nicer than I expected. They've obviously invested significantly in improvements recently." "That's great news," Michael said, his relief audible. "I knew you'd feel better about it once you saw the place for yourself. What did you think of the staff?" "Professional, competent. They seem to genuinely care about the residents' well-being rather than just managing them efficiently." "Perfect. So you're feeling more comfortable with the idea?" The question hung in the air while I considered how much truth to reveal. Michael wanted reassurance that his plan was proceeding smoothly, that his assessment of my needs was accurate, that his timeline for resolving what he saw as the problem of my independence could move forward without further complications. "I'm still processing everything," I said finally. "It's a big decision, and I want to make sure I'm choosing what's right for me rather than what's convenient for everyone else." The subtle criticism registered in his silence. "Mom, you know that's not what this is about. We're concerned about your safety, your well-being. Nobody's trying to make this convenient for us." "Of course not," I said, though we both knew the statement wasn't entirely accurate. Convenience might not be their primary motivation, but it was certainly a factor in their eagerness to transfer responsibility for my care to professional staff. They wouldn't have to coordinate with or supervise directly. "The thing is," Michael continued, The deposit we put down is only held for 30 days. If we're going to secure your spot, we need to make a decision fairly soon. 30 days. The artificial deadline was designed to create urgency, to pressure me into accepting their plan before I had time to fully consider alternatives or develop objections they'd have to address. It was a sales technique disguised as administrative necessity, and it revealed more about their approach to this decision than they probably intended. I understand the time pressure, I said. But Michael, this decision will affect the rest of my life. 30 days isn't unreasonable for that level of consideration. You're right, he said quickly, backtracking from the implicit criticism. Take whatever time you need. We just want to make sure you have good options available. After ending the call, I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the garden I'd been tending for 4 decades. The tomatoes were ripening on schedule, the herbs were flourishing despite the summer heat, and the flower beds were providing the continuous color I'd planned when selecting varieties with different blooming periods. The garden was thriving because I understood its needs, invested in its maintenance, and made decisions based on long-term health rather than short-term convenience. My relationship with my children required the same kind of attention, but they seemed to have concluded that it was easier to transplant me to a different environment rather than address the conditions that were causing our current problems. They saw my independence as the issue rather than recognizing their own diminished investment in our relationship as the real source of their concern about my well-being. The evening news was beginning when Sarah arrived unannounced, letting herself in through the front door with the key I'd given her years ago for emergencies. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I recognized the determination that meant she'd come to have a serious conversation rather than make a casual visit. I brought dinner, she said, holding up a bag from the Chinese restaurant we'd shared. Meals from when she was in college and came home for weekend laundry and motherly advice. I thought we could talk about your visit to Sunset Manor. We sat at my kitchen table, sharing spring rolls and sweet and sour chicken while Sarah probed for information about my reaction to the facility. Her questions were subtle but persistent, designed to identify any remaining objections she'd need to overcome rather than genuinely assess whether the move was appropriate for my current situation. The activities looked interesting, I said, describing the book club and art classes I'd observed. And the residents I spoke with seemed genuinely satisfied with their experience there. That's wonderful, Sarah said, her enthusiasm slightly too bright. I'm so relieved you're feeling positive about it. I was worried you might focus on what you'd be giving up, rather than what you'd be gaining. What I'd be gaining. The phrase suggested that moving to Sunset Manor would improve my life, rather than simply make theirs easier. But improvement was, measured differently depending on whose perspective you used, and I suspected Sarah's definition would be quite different from mine. What do you think I'd be gaining? I asked. Security, she said immediately. Peace of mind, knowing that help is available if you need it. Social interaction with people your own age. Activities designed for your interests and abilities. Medical support that's available around the clock. Each benefit she listed was real, though none addressed needs I was currently struggling to meet independently. The security was protection against problems I hadn't experienced. The social interaction would replace relationships I was maintaining successfully on my own. The activities would substitute for interests I was pursuing without institutional programming. The medical support would provide services I was already receiving through my established healthcare providers. Those are all valuable things, I agreed. But Sarah, I want you to understand something. Moving to Sunset Manor isn't just about gaining new support systems. It's also about giving up the independence I've worked my entire adult life to maintain. Her expression softened slightly, and for a moment I glimpsed the daughter who used to seek my advice about difficult decisions, rather than the adult who'd concluded my decision-making capabilities were compromised. I know it's hard, Mom, but independence isn't worth risking your safety or health. My safety and health aren't currently at risk, I pointed out gently. What you're asking me to give up is real and immediate. What you're protecting me from is hypothetical and future. The conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah presenting her case and me raising questions that she interpreted as resistance rather than legitimate concerns requiring thoughtful responses. By the time she left, we'd reached an impasse disguised as mutual understanding. She believed she'd made progress in convincing me to accept the inevitable. I understood more clearly than ever that my children had already made their decision, and were simply managing my transition to accepting it. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation in their approach. They'd assumed that because I was considering their plan, I was surrendering control over my own future. They had no idea that I'd already taken control in ways they couldn't imagine, preparing for outcomes they hadn't considered, and ensuring that whatever happened next would be on my terms rather than theirs. The 30-day deadline they'd imposed would be met, but not in the way they expected. And when the time came to reveal the full scope of my preparation, they would learn that the woman they'd underestimated had been planning several moves ahead of them all along. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick with legal documents that would change everything my children thought they understood about their carefully orchestrated plan. I'd been expecting it for 3 days, ever since my attorney had called to confirm that all the paperwork was finalized and ready for implementation. The timing was perfect, exactly 2 weeks before the 30-day deadline Michael and Sarah had imposed for my decision about Sunset Manor. I carried the envelope to my kitchen table, where my coffee was still steaming and the morning light provided perfect illumination for reading legal documents that would reshape the power dynamic in our family. Inside were 3 sets of papers: the updated ownership documentation for Sunset Manor that removed the trust structure and put the property directly in my name, the revised power of attorney agreements that stripped Sarah and Michael of any authority over my medical or financial decisions, and the new will that made their inheritance contingent on their treatment of me during my remaining years. But the most important document was the one I'd drafted myself, typed on my personal letterhead and notarized 3 days earlier. It was addressed to both my children, though they wouldn't receive it until I decided the moment was right for revelation. The letter began simply, "By the time you read this, you'll understand that the woman you've been trying to manage has been managing you." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then walked to my home office where I'd been conducting the real business of preparing for this confrontation. The past 3 weeks had been a masterpiece of strategic planning, with every phone call, every meeting, every document review building toward the moment when my children would discover exactly how wrong they'd been about my capabilities and intentions. The first call I made was to David Rodriguez at Sunset Manor, though this time I identified myself by my real name, rather than the alias I'd used for my facility tour. His surprise was audible when I explained that I was the property owner and would be visiting later that morning to discuss some immediate operational changes. "Mrs. Campbell," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I had no idea you were when you toured the facility, I thought, you thought I was a potential resident being processed for admission by concerned family members," I said, saving him from having to articulate the awkward truth. "That was exactly what I wanted you to think. Your performance during that tour told me everything I needed to know about how you treat families during one of the most difficult decisions they'll ever make." The silence on his end was heavy with implications. David was smart enough to understand that he'd been tested without knowing it, and professional enough to recognize that the test results would determine his continued employment at the facility. He'd been working to improve. "Your approach was exactly what I hoped to see," I continued, putting him out of his misery. "Respectful, informative, focused on resident well-being rather than administrative convenience. That's why you're going to continue managing this facility, though your role is about to become significantly more interesting." We arranged to meet at 11 o'clock, giving me time to review the operational reports I'd been receiving monthly, but hadn't previously discussed with him directly. The financial performance was exceeding projections, resident satisfaction scores were at an all-time high, and the waiting list had grown to 53 people seeking admission to what was now considered the premier senior living facility in our region. but numbers only told part of the story. The real measure of success was in the details I'd observed during unannounced visits over the past 6 months, when I'd arrived as an anonymous visitor to check on elderly friends or deliver donations to the facility's community programs. Staff, members who didn't know I was their employer, had consistently demonstrated the kind of caring professionalism that couldn't be faked or mandated through policy memos. I'd watched nurses spend extra time explaining medication changes to confused residents. I'd seen activity coordinators adapt programming to accommodate individual interests and limitations. I'd observed housekeeping staff engaging in genuine conversations with residents rather than treating them as obstacles to efficient room cleaning. The culture of respect and dignity I'd tried to establish through hiring practices and training programs had taken root organically, creating an environment where elderly people were treated as valued community members, rather than problems requiring management. At exactly 11 o'clock, I walked into Sunset Manor as the owner for the first time, though several staff members recognized me from my previous visits and greeted me with the warm familiarity reserved for someone who belonged in their community. David met me at the front desk, his professional composure intact despite what must have been a morning of considerable anxiety about our upcoming conversation. "Before we talk about operational matters," I said, "I want you to understand why I've been conducting this somewhat elaborate evaluation of your management approach. My own family is pressuring me to move into this facility, and I needed to know whether the place they're eager to warehouse me actually provides the quality of care I would find acceptable." David's expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching personal investment in the conversation. "And what did you conclude? That if I do eventually need residential care, Sunset Manor would be an appropriate choice. But more importantly, that other families making similar decisions can trust you to provide honest guidance rather than sales pressure during what may be the most difficult transition of their lives." We spent 2 hours reviewing every aspect of the facility's operation, from staffing schedules to menu planning to maintenance protocols. I explained the improvements I wanted to implement over the next 6 months, including expanded memory care programming, enhanced rehabilitation services, and a community outreach program that would allow residents to maintain connections with the broader neighborhood rather than being isolated within the facility. The conversation revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated during my months of anonymous ownership. David had been implementing many of the same improvements I'd planned to suggest. His background in healthcare administration included specialized training in person-centered care for elderly residents, and his vision for Sunset Manor aligned perfectly with my own goals for the facility. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," I said as our meeting was concluding. "Within the next few weeks, my children may contact you about accelerating my admission timeline. They believe I've agreed to move here, and they're eager to complete the transition before I change my mind." David's expression suggested he was beginning to understand the complexity of my situation. "How would you like me to handle those inquiries?" "Professionally and honestly," I said. "If they ask about availability, tell them we have openings. If they ask about my visit, tell them I seemed impressed with the facility. If they ask about timing, explain that admission can be arranged within a week once all paperwork is completed. And if they ask whether you seem ready for residential care?" The question hung in the air while I considered how much truth would serve my purposes. "Tell them that in your professional opinion, I appear to be making a thoughtful decision based on realistic assessment of my current needs and future planning. Don't offer any opinions about whether the move is necessary or premature." David nodded, his understanding of the situation clearly evolving as we talked. "May I ask what you're trying to accomplish?" "I'm trying to determine whether my children are capable of respecting my autonomy and involving me as a partner in decisions about my future, or whether they've decided I'm incompetent and need to be managed like a problem they're solving," I said. "Their approach to this situation will determine how I handle other aspects of our relationship going forward." The drive home gave me time to process the morning's conversation and prepare for the next phase of my plan. That afternoon, I had appointments with my financial advisor and my attorney to finalize the documents that would formalize my control over the situation my children thought they were managing. The financial meeting was routine but essential. My advisor had been helping me structure the Sunset Manor investment from the beginning, and he understood both the business rationale and the personal motivations behind my decision to purchase the facility. Today's agenda focused on the tax implications of transferring the property from trust ownership to direct ownership and the estate planning strategies that would protect the facility's mission while providing flexibility for future decisions. Your children are going to be quite surprised when they eventually understand the full scope of what you've accomplished here, he observed as we reviewed the ownership documentation. Surprised might not be strong enough a word, I replied. But shock can be educational, especially for people who've stopped paying attention to information that doesn't fit their preconceptions. The legal meeting was more complex, involving documents that would protect my interests regardless of how the situation with my children ultimately resolved. My attorney had extensive experience with families struggling over elder care decisions, and she understood the importance of maintaining my legal autonomy while preparing for various contingencies. The power of attorney revisions are straightforward, she explained, but I want to make sure you understand the implications. Once these documents are filed, Sarah and Michael will have no authority to make medical or financial decisions on your behalf, even in emergency situations, unless you're declared incompetent by a court. That's exactly what I want, I said. They've been making assumptions about my capabilities based on their convenience rather than my actual needs. I want those assumptions to have no legal standing. We also reviewed the updated will, which included detailed provisions about how my treatment by family members would affect their inheritance. The language was carefully crafted to avoid appearing vindictive, while clearly establishing that respect and dignity were conditions of financial support, both during my lifetime and after my death. This is more complex than traditional estate planning, my attorney noted, but it's becoming increasingly common as people recognize that inheritance can be used to reinforce family values rather than simply transfer wealth. The final document we reviewed was the most important, a comprehensive medical directive that specified my preferences for end-of-life care, appointed an independent healthcare advocate, and explicitly prevented my children from overriding my decisions about medical treatment or living arrangements. The directive had been notarized and filed with my physician, my medical advocate, and the county health department to ensure it couldn't be ignored or challenged if my children decided to pursue guardianship proceedings. By late afternoon, all the legal groundwork was complete. My autonomy was protected, my interests were secured, and my options were preserved regardless of how my children chose to proceed with their plan for my future. But the most satisfying aspect of the day's work wasn't the legal protection. It was the knowledge that while they'd been discussing my declining capabilities, I'd been executing one of the most sophisticated planning processes of my life. That evening, Sarah called with an update on her research into Sunset Manor's services and amenities. She'd obviously been conducting her own investigation, though, from the perspective of someone evaluating a service provider, rather than someone who already owned the business. I spoke with 3 families whose parents live there, she said, her enthusiasm genuine. They all raved about the quality of care and the staff's attention to individual needs. Apparently, there was a change in ownership about a year ago, and the improvements have been dramatic. That's encouraging, I said, allowing her to continue building the case for a decision I'd already made for entirely different reasons. The waiting list is quite long, which is actually a good sign, she continued. It means the facility has a strong reputation in the community, but the administrator assured me that they're holding your spot and can accommodate your move whenever you're ready. David had handled her inquiry exactly as we'd discussed, providing accurate information without revealing the full context of our conversation. His professionalism was reassuring, though I wondered what he'd thought of Sarah's approach to gathering information about my supposed needs and preferences. Have you made a decision about timing? Sarah asked, her voice carefully casual in the way that meant the question was more important than she wanted to acknowledge. "I'm getting closer," I said truthfully. "I should be able to give you a definitive answer within the next week or two." The time frame was accurate, though my decision would be quite different from what she expected. Within 2 weeks, I would know whether my children were capable of treating me as a partner in decisions about my future, or whether they were committed to managing me as a problem requiring solution. Their choice would determine not only my living arrangements, but the fundamental nature of our relationship for whatever years I had remaining. After ending the call, I walked through my house one more time, seeing it through new eyes. This might be my last evening here as someone whose future was uncertain, whose options were limited by other people's assumptions about my capabilities. Tomorrow I would begin the final phase of my plan, the part that would reveal to my children exactly how much they'd underestimated the woman they thought they were protecting from her own poor judgment. The irony was perfect. They wanted to move me to a facility where I'd be safe and well cared for, not knowing that I'd already ensured both outcomes by taking control of the facility myself. They were worried about my ability to make sound decisions, not realizing that I'd been making decisions that would affect not only my own future, but the futures of dozens of other elderly people whose families might face similar challenges. But the deepest irony was that in trying to limit my independence, they'd motivated me to exercise it more completely than I had in years. Their attempt to manage my decline had triggered my most significant accomplishment since retirement. Their concern about my judgment had led to one of the smartest business decisions of my life. The envelope with my letter to them sat on my desk, waiting for the right moment to be delivered. That moment was approaching, though they had no idea what they'd set in motion with their well-intentioned efforts to solve the problem they thought I'd become. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, Sarah's voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Mom, we need to talk. Michael and I are coming over after lunch. There's been a development with the Sunset Manor situation that we need to discuss immediately." A development. The phrase carried the weight of people who'd discovered their careful plans had encountered an unexpected obstacle. Though they had no idea the obstacle was sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee and reading the morning paper with complete awareness of what had triggered their emergency family meeting. I'd been expecting this call for 3 days, ever since David Rodriguez had contacted me to report that both my children had made separate inquiries about expediting my admission to the facility. Sarah had wanted to know if the move could happen within the week, claiming I was eager to make the transition before I lost my nerve. Michael had asked about bypassing some of the standard paperwork to accommodate what he described as my increasing confusion about complex decisions. "Of course," I said, adopting the slightly bewildered tone they expected from someone who didn't understand the urgency of their concern. "Is everything all right? You sound upset." "We're not upset," Sarah said quickly, though her voice suggested otherwise. "We just learned some information about Sunset Manor that changes things significantly. We'll explain everything when we get there." The information they'd learned was undoubtedly my ownership of the facility, though I was curious about how they'd discovered it and what interpretation they'd placed on that discovery. The property records were public, but my name wouldn't appear in casual searches since the purchase had been structured through a trust that had only recently been dissolved. Someone had done substantial research or hired someone else to do it for them. After ending the call, I spent the morning preparing for what would likely be the most important conversation of our relationship in recent years. They would arrive, armed with questions, accusations, and probably a new plan for managing what they perceived as evidence of my deteriorating judgment. They would want explanations for decisions I'd made without consulting them, justifications for actions they considered beyond my capabilities, and reassurances that I understood the implications of what I'd done. But they would also arrive with no understanding of the full scope of my planning, no awareness of the legal protections I'd put in place, and no appreciation for the strategic thinking that had guided every aspect of my Sunset Manor investment. They would be reacting to partial, information while I possessed complete knowledge of the situation they thought they were managing. I used the morning hours to organize the documents they would need to see, though not necessarily in the order or context they expected. The purchase agreement and ownership transfer papers were arranged chronologically, showing the methodical progression of a complex business transaction executed over more than a year. Financial records demonstrated the facility's improved performance under my ownership, with enhanced resident satisfaction and increased profitability. Legal documents proved that every aspect of the purchase had been properly handled through established business channels with appropriate professional oversight. But the most important document remained in my desk drawer. The letter I'd written explaining my motivations and intentions, the one that would force them to confront the gap between their assumptions about my capabilities and the reality of what I'd accomplished while they were worrying about my competence. At exactly 2 o'clock, Michael's car pulled into my driveway, followed immediately by Sarah's sedan. They'd obviously coordinated their arrival time, probably spending the morning comparing notes and developing a strategy for handling what they perceived as a crisis requiring immediate intervention. Their expressions as they walked to my front door were serious enough to suggest they viewed this conversation as an intervention rather than a discussion. "Thank you for making time for this," Michael said as they settled into my living room, his tone carrying the formal courtesy people use when they're preparing to deliver difficult news. "We've discovered some information that raises serious concerns about your recent financial decisions." Sarah pulled out a folder thick with printed documents, clearly the product of extensive research into my business activities. "Mom, we know you purchased Sunset Manor. What we don't understand is why you would make such a major financial commitment without discussing it with us, especially when you're planning to live there yourself." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. They saw my purchase as evidence of impaired judgment, proof that I was making irrational decisions based on confusion or manipulation by unscrupulous people who'd taken advantage of my vulnerability. They couldn't conceive that I'd executed a sophisticated business plan while maintaining complete awareness of both the risks and the potential benefits. "You're right that I purchased the facility," I said calmly. "What concerns you about that decision?" Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest with the patience he probably thought was appropriate for someone whose grasp of complex situations was questionable. "Mom, you spent over $2 million on a business you don't have experience managing in an industry you don't understand, at a time when you're preparing to become a resident yourself. Can you see why that might worry us?" The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. He was speaking to me as if I were a child who'd made a mistake with her allowance money rather than an adult who'd executed a calculated investment strategy. His concern wasn't about the financial wisdom of my decision. It was about my authority to make such decisions without his approval. "What specific aspects of the purchase concern you?" I asked, genuinely curious about which part of my planning. They considered evidence of incompetence. Sarah consulted her folder, obviously prepared with a list of objections they'd developed together. "The price seems excessive for a facility that size. The financing structure is unnecessarily complex. The legal arrangements involve multiple entities that create potential tax complications, and the timing coincides with your own need for residential care, which creates a conflict of interest that could affect your judgment about the quality of services." Each criticism revealed how little they understood about either my motivations or my methods. The price reflected the premium I'd paid for a facility that met my quality standards, rather than settling for the cheapest available option. The financing structure provided tax advantages and legal protections they apparently hadn't researched thoroughly. The multiple entities were standard business practice for this type of investment, not evidence of confusion about simple transactions. But their fundamental misunderstanding was about the relationship between my potential residency and my ownership decision. They saw conflict where I saw alignment, problems where I saw solutions, complications where I saw comprehensive planning for multiple contingencies. "Have you reviewed the facility's financial performance since I purchased it?" I asked. Michael and Sarah exchanged one of their looks, the wordless communication that excluded me from discussions about my own business decisions. "We've seen some basic numbers," Sarah said carefully. "But Mom, profitability isn't the issue. The issue is whether this was an appropriate investment for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation. The phrase encapsulated everything wrong with their approach to this conversation. They'd reduced me to a demographic category rather than evaluating my specific circumstances, capabilities, and objectives. Someone in my situation wasn't supposed to make major business decisions, regardless of their financial resources, professional background, or strategic reasoning. "What exactly is my situation?" I asked. The question clearly made them uncomfortable, forcing them to articulate assumptions they preferred to leave unstated. "You're 68 years old," Michael said finally. "You're preparing to transition to residential care. You're dealing with the stress of major life changes that can affect decision-making, and you're vulnerable to people who might take advantage of your current circumstances." Current circumstances. Another euphemism for the decline they'd diagnosed without evidence, the incompetence they'd assumed based on my age rather than my actions. They couldn't directly say they thought I was losing my mental faculties, but that assumption underlay every aspect of their concern about my Sunset Manor investment. I stood and walked to my desk, retrieving the folder of documents. I'd prepared for this conversation. "I think it's time you understood the full scope of what I've accomplished with this purchase," I said, returning to my chair with the confidence of someone who'd been anticipating this moment for months. The first document I showed them was the original inspection report I'd commissioned before purchasing the facility, a comprehensive evaluation that identified every deficiency in operations, maintenance, staffing, and resident services. The second was the improvement plan I'd developed with consultants who specialized in senior care facility management, a detailed strategy for addressing each identified problem through targeted investments and operational changes. "This wasn't an impulsive purchase," I explained as they reviewed the documents with growing bewilderment. "It was the culmination of 14 months of research, planning, and professional consultation. Every aspect of the transaction was evaluated by experts in healthcare administration, business valuation, and elder care regulations." Sarah looked up from the improvement plan, her expression shifting from concern to confusion. "Mom, this level of planning. This is incredibly sophisticated business analysis. When did you do all this work?" "While you were worried about my ability to manage my own checkbook," I said, allowing a hint of steel to enter my voice. "While you were discussing my declining capabilities and debating whether I could be trusted to live independently." The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of them was ready to acknowledge. They were beginning to understand that their assumptions about my competence had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. The woman they'd been treating as someone who needed protection from her own poor judgment had been executing business plans that exceeded their own professional capabilities. Michael cleared his throat, the sound he made when he was trying to process information that didn't fit his existing understanding of a situation. "The facility has improved significantly since you purchased it," he said slowly. "The staff seems more professional, the programs are more comprehensive, and the physical improvements are obvious. Those improvements represent $800,000 in additional investment beyond the purchase price," I said. "Every modification was planned to enhance resident quality of life while ensuring the facility's long-term financial viability. The result is a business that serves its community while generating sufficient revenue to fund continued improvements." Sarah was reviewing the financial projections, her background in retail management giving her enough business knowledge to understand the sophistication of what I'd accomplished. "These numbers are impressive," she admitted. "But Mom, why didn't you tell us what you were planning? Why let us worry about your financial decisions when you were obviously making very smart investments?" The question revealed how completely they'd missed the point of my secrecy. "Because you never asked about my financial decisions," I said, quietly. You assumed I wasn't making any decisions worth discussing. You concluded that my age and circumstances meant I needed your oversight rather than your partnership. The truth of that statement was uncomfortable enough to generate another silence, this one tinged with the recognition that their concern about my welfare had blinded them to evidence of my continued competence. They'd been so focused on protecting me from imaginary threats that they'd failed to notice my actual accomplishments. "There's something else you need to understand," I continued, pulling out the final document from my folder. "The legal structure I established for this purchase includes provisions that directly relate to your plan for my residential care." The document was my updated will, specifically the sections that dealt with Sunset Manor and my children's potential inheritance of the facility. I watched their faces as they read the provisions that would make them responsible for maintaining the quality standards I'd established, continuing the resident-focused programming I'd implemented, and ensuring that future ownership changes didn't compromise the care provided to elderly people who'd trusted the facility with their well-being. "If you proceed with your plan to place me in Sunset Manor," I said as they absorbed the implications of what they were reading, "you will eventually inherit the responsibility for ensuring that other families don't have to worry about the quality of care their elderly relatives receive." Michael looked up from the will, his expression reflecting the dawning realization that my Sunset Manor purchase hadn't been separate from their plan for my care. It had been a direct response to it. "You bought the facility because we wanted you to live there?" "I bought the facility because I wanted to ensure that if I ever needed residential care, that care would meet my standards rather than your budget," I corrected. "The irony that you're now proposing to move me to a place I already own is just a bonus." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with my children gradually understanding that every assumption they'd made about my situation had been wrong. I wasn't declining, I was planning. I wasn't confused, I was strategic. I wasn't vulnerable, I was prepared. The woman they'd been trying to protect had been protecting herself more effectively than they'd ever imagined. But the most important revelation was still to come. They understood now that I'd purchased Sunset Manor, that the facility was performing well under my ownership, and that their plan to move me there would essentially be delivering me to my own property. What they didn't yet understand was that this discovery was only the beginning of what they would learn about the decisions I'd been making, while they assumed I wasn't capable of making any decisions at all. The letter in my desk drawer would wait for another day, when they'd had time to process what they'd already learned, and were ready for the next phase of their education about the woman they thought they knew. The letter I'd written 3 weeks earlier sat unopened on my kitchen table as Sarah and Michael absorbed the magnitude of their miscalculation. Their faces reflected a mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of respect, though that last element was still fragile, uncertain, like a plant trying to grow in soil that hadn't been properly prepared. "Mom," Sarah said finally, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, "we need to apologize. We've been treating you like you couldn't handle your own affairs when you've obviously been handling them better than we handle ours." The apology was a start, but apologies without changed behavior were just words designed to restore comfort rather than address underlying problems. I needed to know whether they understood not just that they'd been wrong about my capabilities, but that their approach to our relationship had been fundamentally disrespectful. "The apology is appreciated," I said, "but I need you to understand something more important than your mistake about my business competence. For the past year, you've been making decisions about my future without including me as an equal partner in those decisions. You've been discussing my limitations instead of asking about my actual needs. You've been treating me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We thought we were helping. We thought you needed protection from making decisions that might not be in your best interest." "But whose definition of best interest were you using?" I asked. "Mine or yours? Because moving me to Sunset Manor might be convenient for your schedules and peace of mind, but it wasn't necessary for my safety or well-being. The Distinction was crucial, though I could see they were still struggling to fully grasp its implications. They had genuinely believed they were acting in my best interests, but they'd defined those interests based on their own concerns and assumptions rather than my actual preferences and capabilities. Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest, with the kind of attention she used to give me when she was young and genuinely wanted to understand something important. "What do you need from us going forward? How do we fix this?" The question suggested they were finally ready to have the conversation we should have been having all along. One where my perspective was valued equally with their concerns, where my autonomy was respected even when they disagreed with my choices. "Need you to ask me what I want instead of telling me what you think I need," I said. "I need you to treat me as a partner in decisions about my life, rather than as someone whose consent you need to obtain for decisions you've already made. And I need you to trust that if I do eventually need more support, I'm capable of recognizing that need and addressing it appropriately." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was thoughtful, the kind of quiet that comes when people are actually processing new information rather than simply waiting for their turn to present counter-arguments. "Do you want to continue living here independently?" Michael asked, and I could hear him genuinely trying to ask rather than lead me toward a predetermined answer. "For now, yes," I said. "I'm managing well, I'm engaged with my community, and I'm satisfied with my current living situation. But I also recognize that could change, and when it does, I'll have one of the best senior living facilities in the region available to me. One where I know the quality of care meets my standards." "Because you own it," Sarah said, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she smiled. "Mom, that's actually brilliant. You've solved the problem we were worried about while maintaining complete control over the solution." The recognition was gratifying, though it had taken them far too long to reach it. "The facility isn't just for me," I explained. "It's for every elderly person whose family is facing the same decisions you thought you were making. Every resident, their benefits from the improvements I've implemented, the staff training I've funded, and the quality standards I've established." I stood and walked to my desk, retrieving the folder that contained the most meaningful documents related to my Sunset Manor ownership. Not the financial reports or business plans, but the letters from residents and their families expressing gratitude for the changes they'd experienced since the ownership transition. "This is what the investment has really accomplished," I said, handing them a letter from an 83-year-old woman whose daughter had been struggling with guilt about placing her mother in residential care. The letter described how the enhanced programming and respectful staff treatment had transformed her mother's experience from institutional warehousing to genuine community living. Michael read the letter aloud, his voice catching slightly on the final paragraph. "My mother actually looks forward to each day now, instead of just enduring them. She's made friends, discovered new interests, and maintained her dignity during a transition I was terrified would diminish her. Thank you for creating a place where elderly people are truly cared for, rather than simply managed." "There are 47 letters like that in the file," I said. "Each one represents someone whose quality of life improved because I refused to accept that adequate care was good enough when excellent care was possible." Sarah was reading another letter, this one from a man whose father had dementia and had been struggling in a different facility before transferring to Sunset Manor. "The specialized programming you implemented has made such a difference for people with memory issues," she observed. "This family says their father is calmer, more engaged, and seems genuinely happy for the first time since his diagnosis. That's why I bought the facility," I said. "Not because I wanted to run a business, but because I wanted to ensure that when people like your father, or like me eventually, need residential care, that care is provided with dignity and respect rather than just efficiency and cost containment." The afternoon sun was slanting through my kitchen windows as we talked, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift as our conversation evolved from confrontation to understanding. For the first time in months, I felt like I was talking with my children rather than being talked at by people who'd already decided what was best for me. "What happens now?" Michael asked. "With Sunset Manor? With your living situation? With us?" The question was open-ended enough to suggest he was genuinely ready to hear my answer rather than looking for confirmation of his own assumptions. "Now you understand that the woman you were worried about has been taking care of herself quite effectively," I said. "And now we develop a different kind of relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than your perceived need to protect me from my own decisions." Sarah reached across the table and took my hand, a gesture of connection rather than condescension. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished," she said, "and I'm sorry it took us so long to see it." The apology felt genuine this time, backed by recognition of what they'd missed, rather than just regret about being caught in their assumptions. But the real test would be how they behaved going forward, whether they could sustain this new understanding, when they weren't confronted with overwhelming evidence of their misjudgment. "There's one more thing," I said, pulling out the letter I'd written weeks earlier. "I want you to read this, not because you need to be punished for your mistakes, but because you need to understand how your approach to this situation affected me." They read the letter together, their expressions growing more somber as they absorbed my documented feelings about being reduced to a problem requiring solution, about having my autonomy questioned by people who'd benefited from my competence for decades, about feeling like I'd become invisible to the children I'd raised to be thoughtful, respectful adults. When they finished reading, Michael set the letter down carefully and looked directly at me. "We lost sight of who you are," he said. "We got so focused on who we thought you were becoming that we forgot who you've always been." "And who have I always been?" I asked. "Strong, independent, capable of handling whatever challenges come your way," Sarah said. "The woman who raised us to be self-sufficient and confident. The woman who served her country and her family with equal dedication. The woman who never stopped growing or learning or contributing, even when other people thought she should slow down." The recognition was everything I'd hoped for but hadn't dared expect. They finally saw me as I actually was rather than as their projection of what someone my age should be experiencing. They understood that their assumptions had been wrong not just about my specific capabilities, but about the fundamental nature of aging and independence. "So what's next?" I asked. "Next, we ask you what you want instead of telling you what we think you need," Michael said. "Next, we include you in discussions about your future instead of having those discussions without you. Next, we treat you like the competent adult you've never stopped being." The sun was setting as they prepared to leave, casting long shadows across my garden where the tomatoes were still ripening and the flowers were still blooming under my careful attention. As they gathered their papers and prepared to return to their own lives, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of being truly seen and understood by the people who mattered most to me. "One last question," Sarah said, as she paused at my front door. "Are you happy with how this all turned out?" I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd been a grandmother whose children thought she was declining into incompetence. Today, I was the owner of a thriving business that provided excellent care to dozens of elderly residents while generating strong financial returns. More importantly, I was a woman whose family had rediscovered her worth and capabilities. "I'm satisfied," I said, "though it would have been easier if you'd simply asked me what I wanted in the first place." They left with promises to call more often, visit more regularly, and include me more meaningfully in family decisions that affected my life. Time would tell whether those promises would be kept, but the conversation we'd had gave me hope that our relationship could evolve into something healthier than it had been. That evening, I walked through Sunset Manor as its owner for the first time openly, introducing myself to residents who'd known me as a visitor, but not as the person responsible for the improvements they'd been enjoying. The conversations were warm, appreciative, and filled with the kind of genuine connection that reminded me why I'd invested in this place. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. My children's attempt to manage my decline had motivated me to demonstrate my continued growth. Their concern about my judgment had led to one of my best decisions. Their effort to limit my independence had resulted in my most significant exercise of autonomy in years. The lesson I realized wasn't just for them. It was for anyone who's ever been underestimated because of their age, dismissed because of others' assumptions, or treated as less capable than they actually are. Sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued isn't argument or protest. It's simply proving, through your actions and accomplishments, exactly how wrong those assumptions were. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, the people who underestimated you are capable of recognizing their mistake and learning from it. Sometimes love is strong enough to overcome even the most stubborn assumptions about what someone can or cannot do. But whether they learn or not, you still have the satisfaction of knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. And that knowledge, once firmly established, can never be taken away from you by anyone else's limitations of imagination. Hey, thanks for watching this story about Eleanor's remarkable journey. If you enjoyed seeing how she turned her family's assumptions upside down and created something beautiful in the process, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Stories like these remind us that age is just a number, and wisdom, combined with determination, can accomplish incredible things. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories about people who refuse to be underestimated. Until next time, remember, you're never too old to surprise the people who think they have you figured out.